Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast. I'm Robert Bryce. On this podcast, we talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics. And I'm pleased to welcome my guest, Gregg Easterbrook. He is the author of The Blue Age, How the U.S. Navy Created Global Prosperity and Why We're in Danger of Losing It. Gregg, welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast.
Great to be here, Robert.
So I didn't warn you. I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself on this podcast. I could talk about your history and where you've been, what you're about, but imagine you've arrived somewhere, you don't know anyone, and you have 45 or 60 seconds. Tell us who you are, if you don't mind.
Well, really, Robert, it's boastful to talk about the Nobel Prizes, so I never really bring it up.
Well, okay, forget those and all the curing cancer, the rest of that. Just go ahead and just a general introduction will do.
I'm a writer. The Blue Age is my 12th book. I am a little quirky in that I write several genres. I write serious public policy nonfiction, which is what the Blue Age is. It's a public policy book about current events. I also write literary fiction. I've had 3 literary novels published. Number 4 is finished and will be published next year. And to put my kids through college, I wrote about sports for many years. I've written several books about sports. So all 3 of those genres have nothing to do with each other, but they're all subjects that interest me. I also have lifelong associations with the Atlantic Monthly and Washington Monthly as an editor or writer.
Okay, well, that's good. So I want to come back to football because you've written a couple of books about football, and football I'm a basketball guy. Football's kind of a guilty pleasure for me, but we'll set that aside for a minute. So let's talk about the Blue Age. And as before you've 12, this is your 12th book. You've also written The Progress Paradox. It's Better Than It Looks. I want to come back to those as well. But tell me about the Blue Age, which I've read. I read it cover to cover. I don't do that very often. Very well written, great history, naval history. Why did you write this book? And was it part of what the flow from other books that you've written? How did this book come about?
A little bit. I'll tell you how it started. My previous book, It's Better Than It Looks, the title kind of says what that book is an argument that the United States and the larger world are in better condition than most people understand. And that book was published in 2018, the 2 years before COVID. But I think the basic, even taking into account all the damage that COVID has done, I think the basic thesis is still true. That the condition of the United States and of most of the world is much better than people think. So that book has chapters on why various disasters haven't happened. One of them is general war. I talk about how in the last 25 years, now it's only been 25 years, but in the last 25 years, the frequency and intensity of war has declined almost everywhere in the world. The casualties from combat have gone down almost everywhere in the world. And for a human being today has the lowest chance of being killed by war of any human being at any point in history, even if you go far back into the past. So that seems pretty good. And in the course of that chapter, there's one page saying, for example, in my lifetime, I don't want to shock your audience by telling you how old I am, but in my lifetime, there's been no major naval battle and only one medium-sized battle on the water, my whole life. You've got to go back to the Phoenicians to find another period as long as my life without desperate, bloody, destructive fighting on the seas. And we tend not to be aware of battle at sea because the ships that are hit sunk. The sailors that die, their bodies disappear beneath the waves. We can't build monuments at sea. We can't visit the sites of naval battles. We don't think about them very much, but in the long, bloody history of humanity, there's been, as Teddy Roosevelt said, as much fighting at sea as there has been on land. So in our lifetimes, this hasn't happened. Why? And my editor looked at me and said, Gregg, that's your next book. So that's the origin of the Blue Age. The first third of it is about naval history and the current maritime posture of the world's naval forces. And I celebrate the United States Navy because it's been good for the world. The United States Navy is good for the world. It's reduced fighting at sea. It serves as a guardian, not a conqueror. It protects ships of almost all nations. The world has been much better off with the United States having monopoly on sea power. This may not last, but currently certainly we're better off. But that's just the first third of the book. The second third is about international trade. And trade is made possible by quiet seas. If merchant ships were being sunk, we certainly wouldn't have container liners on their way to Los Angeles right now. Container liners wouldn't be moving anywhere in the world, and there'd be a lot more poverty and a lot less prosperity if that were the case. And the final third of the book is about the need for a sensible ocean governance scheme to make sure that we protect the ocean environment and make sure that the Arctic Ocean, which is about to become navigable, is shared for the good of all humanity instead of us fighting over it or polluting it. We need a much better system of ocean governance to assure those ends. And the third of the book is about how we might go about doing that.
Good. Well, that's a great outline. So you've done. One of the reasons why I enjoyed the book so much was I know nothing really about naval history. I mean, a little bit, but it seems like you didn't just do this overnight. It seems like has naval history been an issue been an interest of yours for a while? Is this a new passion?
I've read a fair amount about it. I started thinking about this book 10 years ago. I gave a lecture about internationalism at the Naval War College in Rhode Island. And besides being exposed to the professors, they're all smart men and women. It struck me when I was there that the United States has something that all the great powers of the world have wanted for 500 years, and that's control of the sea. The British wanted this. The Dutch wanted this, the Spaniards, the Portuguese, many nations sought control of the sea. We're the only nation that's ever achieved it. In the post-war era, we've had total control of the oceans of the world. And yet American academia doesn't study this. Maritime power is much studied in Europe. Now, Europe has a longer experience with it than we do, but any good college in any nation in Europe would have a maritime studies department and professors who specialize in this subject. People like that are extremely rare in the United States. The Ivy League only has a couple of maritime historians. Most really good colleges don't have anybody at all teaching that subject. And there's a Naval War College and the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, but they are comparatively small fish on the American education landscape. So this was 10, 15 years ago. I was kind of struck by, why aren't people thinking about this more than they are? And so I hope I've now done my contribution to that effort.
Well, I think you have. I mean, it's a remarkable history and something that many things that I had no idea about. Let me talk about the Battle of Leyte Gulf, because you wrote about this at length, and saying that this was the last major ocean battle, and that since October 1944. You write, there has been only sporadic combat at sea, nothing close to the almost incessant warfare on the oceans that characterized the previous 3 millennia. Now, you mentioned the Falklands War as one example, but so why was Leyte so pivotal? What was it? Was it just that the U.S. won World War II, and after that, no one else could stand up to the U.S. Navy? Why was that the pivotal battle in terms of recent history?
That was the battle in October of 1944, in which the United States Navy basically sunk the Japanese Navy, and it was an unqualified victory for the United States, and it meant that there was no question that Japan would be defeated in the Pacific phase of World War II, although many thousands of people died before the final surrender was offered. But that battle ended the Pacific War favorably for the Allied side, and we're all glad that it ended that way, including I think everybody who lives in Japan now is glad that it ended that way, because the world improved a great deal when Japanese fascism was defeated. But after that, the United States pretty much took command of the oceans. The British, who had been the previous number one, were so broken and damaged and exhausted by war that they had to spend the next full generation just helping their own country recover, and that was the proper priority for them. The Germans that had been trying to take over the oceans, of course, were completely obliterated. The Soviet Union tried a little bit, but never really had its heart in ocean control. It was much more concerned with continental politics, and also nowhere near as productive as the United States was. The Japanese had been completely knocked out of the naval business. All the other major powers that had asserted themselves at sea suddenly were out of the picture. And there was just the United States as the wealthiest and most productive country in the world. We're still the wealthiest and most productive country in the world. But we've been the wealthiest and most productive country for a full century. And we've built lots of really good ships. And they're they have many accomplishments. Now, whether a new naval arms race will start, that's one of the troubling questions of this subject. But since World War II, no one's even attempted to challenge the United States Navy because they know they're going to lose. What's the point? Why even try?
Well, so let's talk about that. Well, I want to talk about the 300 ship Navy, but before that, I want to talk about Albert Thayer Mahan, who I guess would be the von Clausewitz of naval history, right? I mean, in terms of the pivotal figures or ones that are considered, big thinkers in terms of naval warfare. I want to read this whole section here because it's interesting, and I've heard about Mahan and read a little bit about him in the past. That you say that Mahan's opinions played a role in the worst wars of the 20th century. Mahan had the good sense to die in 19.
Okay, now I see you moving, but I don't hear you.
Somehow.
Now
okay.
I hear you.
Yeah, somehow I got... you got muted as well.
How about that? Can you hear me?
Somehow my audio switched here. I'm not hearing you in my...
All right.
Stand by 1 second.
Okay.
Now say something, please.
7 years ago, our forefathers were brought forth on this continent, a new nation.
I don't know.
Can you hear me?
My... Okay, somehow my audio got switched here. So let me just ask about Mahan again here. I'll start.
Okay, sure thing.
Now I think I've got you. Say one more thing if you don't mind.
Sure.
Yeah, I got you.
I can hear you fine, Robert.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Okay, so I want to ask about Albert Thayer Mahan, who you write about a good deal. You say that Mahan's theories were three. First, that naval force is the essence of great power. Second, that fighting ships need not be deployed. After all, Mahan himself was a bust on the waters. Rather, it could float at anchor. And third, that if it's sent into action, a navy should concentrate all force into a single decisive melee. So why was Mahan so influential? You write about his influence on Teddy Roosevelt. And why was he so wrong?
Well, perhaps it's a writer's luxury on my part to spend 5 or 6 pages digressing on this subject. During the 19th century, studying Alfred Thayer Mahan was the essence of understanding sea power, and he had tremendous influence on the starts of World War I and World War II. It's really important that we bear in mind that everyone is taught in high school that World War I began because an anarchist assassinated the man in line to the Austrian throne, and that was a precipitating event. But 5 years previous to that,
in Sarajevo.
Yeah, yes.
Right.
5 years before that, there had been a naval arms race between England and Germany, and they were literally pointing cannons at each other at sea, and something bad was bad to happen, and something bad then happened. And we had another naval arms race before World War II that once again reprised England and Germany, but also Japan and the United States. We had 2 naval arms races going on at once. Well, why did we have these naval arms races? The political leadership of Germany and Japan were total devotees of Alfred Thayer Mahan. They thought the way to conquer the world was to build a giant navy, have it sitting at port like he wanted, and then concentrate it all into one decisive battle. Well, so how did that work out for you, Germany? How did that work out for you, Japan? Following this guy's ideas led to the total destruction of 2 of the most important societies on earth. German and Japanese cities were smoldering ruins at the end of World War II, and they had followed Mahan pretty much to the letter. Now, you hear some people argue that we've followed Mahan too. I don't really think that's true. That's probably enough digression on him, but I don't think it's really true that the United States uses Mahanian strategy. At any rate, all of his strategies were based on the heroic age of sail, which does engage the imagination, but doesn't have anything to do with nuclear submarines and precision-guided missiles and so on. The naval analysis he did stopped before the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. It's all about the conditions of previous centuries, and it really isn't much relevant to today. Although the Chinese quote Mahan constantly. So.
Well, you mentioned nuclear submarines here because that was one of the other things that you spent a great deal of time talking about, and I understand why. There are people who've argued, well, nuclear weapons have made the world safer, and it seems to me you're making a very similar argument that you write about nuclear subs, and you wrote this: nuclear deterrence is creepy in the extremists, but has discouraged war. So, have nuclear submarines made all-out war unthinkable?
Well, we can sure hope so. I think it's not appreciated by many people the extent to which the nuclear submarines, mainly the ones that the United States possesses, but also a few that Russia has and a few that China has, are astonishingly horrific. The Ohio class subs that we have now are capable of destroying. Each individual submarine could destroy 300 cities. And we've got a bunch of them. And the Columbia class that we're building will carry slightly fewer warheads, but have much better accuracy and be impossible to find. It's a tremendous gamble with history to have nuclear weapons to begin with. But that said, since nuclear weapons have come into the world, there's been no great power fighting. They've never been used irrationally. They've only been used once against Japan in 1945. We can hope that they will always be in the hands of rational leaders. We remember Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev jointly declared in 1985, a nuclear war cannot be won. And as long as the leaders who control the bomb buttons understand that, and so far they all have, no harm has come of it, and there's no great power fighting it. And the ultimate way to ensure that is nuclear submarines, because it's vaguely possible to imagine the first strike that would destroy the missiles or bombers of the United States or Russia or China on the ground. And nobody can figure out how you could sink all the nuclear submarines at once. It's probably impossible. So as long as it stays impossible, probably there won't be any great power war.
One of the things that was also clear in the book was you have a great affection for the sailors that you met. And you met quite a few of them. So how many places did you go? You went, I mean, it looked to me like you went all over the world in visiting some of these locations. How many places did you visit?
Well, if it looked that way to you, Robert, I did a great job as a writer of creating an illusion for the reader.
Okay, fair enough.
I did visit a number of ports and naval bases, but I didn't go all over the world. I actually applied to Carnegie for funding to do that very thing, and they said no. So,
okay. Well, so you met a number of characters there, sailors. Who stands out among those? You quoted several of them. What event or what place was really stands out in your mind? That
I'll tell you, I talked to a number. I mainly interviewed people from the U.S. Navy, although I did talk some to the Royal Navy and the Japanese Navy, which has a cumbersome official name anyway, the Japanese Navy. And I found them, to a man and to a woman, because a surprising number of them were women, to be well informed about the world and to be thoughtful. Now, I was talking to officers. You expect officers are almost always college graduates. You expect them to be well informed. But I was pleasantly surprised at how much they knew about the world and how thoughtful they were on national security issues. And I had informal debates with some of them. We didn't necessarily agree, but they certainly knew their stuff, and I found that impressive.
So, but of those, you also went aboard several ships. I think you were aboard the Wasp as well. Is that correct?
Yes, I spent quite a bit of time aboard the Wasp. The Wasp, if you looked at it, you'd say that's an aircraft carrier. It's actually an assault ship, but physically it's very similar to an aircraft carrier. And it has a storied history. If you want to quote one individual, I would point you to in the book the XO warship called the Oak Hill. She's since become the commander, a woman named Catherine Wijnaldum. She's married to a Dutch man, and hence her last name, who is an African-American woman from the Deep South. She grew up in rural Georgia. She went to the Naval Academy. She became an officer, and she's now, since the book was published, she's been promoted to commander of the Oak Hill. And I just found it, I mean, maybe it's too easy to be impressed by changes in society, but I just found it fascinating that a gigantic American warship bristling with super advanced weapons, the commander was an African-American woman from the Deep South, who's a political conservative and a Donald Trump supporter. I just found that fascinating.
Well, and you make several references there too about different U.S. Navy ships, being one named for an Asian American. I don't remember the name, but that you make a point throughout that the Navy, the the mix of people and backgrounds in the Navy, and even the mix of the names of the ships is reflective of kind of the American, the diversity of America. Is that
Yes, we have a guided missile destroyer named the Chung Hoon, and it's named for Gordon Chung Hoon, a retired admiral. He's since passed away, who was the first flag rank Asian American officer. His parents were Chinese. He grew up in Hawaii. His features, his appearance, his accent, it was all Chinese, and yet he was a great American patriot, and kind of guy who if you cut him, he bled red, white, and blue. So America has an important warship named after a man of Chinese heritage. How long is it going to be till China has a warship named after a man of American heritage? I think you're going to have to wait for that one.
That's yes, agreed. Well, so let's talk about the size of the fleet, because this is something it seems to me in the book you really wrestle with, about what's the right size. And you point out that ships like the Wasp, although they're an assault vessel, that they're eventually going to be, or I think you point out that they're eventually going to add weapons to it to make it these ships more lethal. I'll get to the question. So I've heard for decades about the idea of the 300 ship Navy, or even the 400 ship Navy. What's the right number?
I doubt that there's a right number. The camps are, we need more ships, versus we have to live with the ships that we've already got, which is kind of how I feel, just for budget reasons. Obviously, the Navy used to have far more ships than it has today. But the Air Force used to have more airplanes, and the Army used to have more tanks, and so on. The total numbers in all major militaries is declining. Same with the Russians, same with the Chinese. As weapons get more expensive, but also more lethal, you tend to have fewer of them, and the ones that you have are more frightful. And that's certainly been the case with the U.S. Navy. When Ronald Reagan was president, one of his goals was a 600-ship Navy. Now we have a little under 300. During the 2012 presidential debate between Barack Obama and Mitt Romney, this was one of the things that they wrestled over. Romney wanted a bigger Navy. Obama's view was that we can live with the Navy that we've got. And I just think for budget reasons, everyone knows how much money the presidents of both parties have borrowed and spent in recent years. Our children and grandchildren are going to have to pay off those debts. There really isn't room in an entitlement state for a big expansion of the Navy. I think 300 or so ships of various types. We may change the types of ships that we build, but the numbers are not going to get that much bigger unless we build a lot of tiny drone ships, and then you count the tiny drone ships. Maybe you could get to a bigger number in that way, but certainly we're not going to have more supercarriers in the future. Right now we've got 11. There's 2 more under construction, and 2 more are likely to be built because the initial funding has come through. I think those will be the last supercarriers that the United States builds, and they may very well be the last supercarriers that any nation builds.
Well, let's talk about that, because you make the good point, and it's one that's been in the news lately, about hypersonic missiles and the vulnerability of these massive ships that are, tens of billions of dollars, or 10 billion anyway, right? Something like that. I mean, these are incredibly expensive, 5,000 sailors on each one, that they're not invincible, and that they, you make this point in several places in the book, that they could be hit with a relatively inexpensive missile that would potentially change the whole idea about supercarriers. How vulnerable are they, do you think?
We can only speculate. No one has ever attacked a supercarrier. Supercarriers have only existed, and when we say supercarrier, we mean a nuclear-powered wide-deck carrier that can launch long-range ships. Okay, so far we're the only nation that's possessed them. No one has attacked us since World War II, and so nobody's attacked a supercarrier. We don't know what would happen if one was hit by a hypersonic missile or some other kind of weapon. However, it's not likely to be pretty. So if you have a ship that costs $10 to $15 billion to build, and your opponent doesn't have any ship of similar value and prestige level, if the Chinese manage to sink one of our supercarriers, I think it would be a national shock of the Sputnik level here in the United States. How could this possibly happen? Whereas if we sunk a bunch of Chinese ships, everybody would say, well, of course, they're the Chinese. Of course you sunk their ships. So there's a different great power political measure to the United States possessing supercarriers that doesn't really affect other nations. And this is one of the many reasons I think the age of the supercarrier is ending.
Well, so that brings up this other question. I've talked with other friends of mine who've been in the military or military strategists about this idea of, what is it? Quantity has a quality all its own, right? That you can have that, this debate between having a lot of aircraft versus a few that are really good, right? So you've said that you think we're not going to grow the Navy much, but should we be thinking about quantity over quality, or is this is it just an inevitable kind of tension in the way weapons and big militaries operate?
Well, in the Blue Age, I quote Mr. Spock of Star Trek on this question, who told Captain Kirk every military advantage is fleeting. History shows that every time you come up with a technological military advantage, within 10 years, your opponent has it too, and then you have to come up with something else. So the thing that the United States and China are working on right now is small distributed platform, little drones that are jet powered, or some cases drone helicopters, or that can operate underwater. You can build them in large numbers because they're not that expensive. They're also not that capable. But if there's 50 of them coming at you once, will you be able to shoot them all down? If you look at a modern, say that the U.S. destroyer Chang'un that we just mentioned, a modern guided missile destroyer, it has several point defense cannons around it that are automated, that the computer controls how they fire. They're radar directed. They fire thousands of cannon rounds a second. They would probably be impossible for a big aircraft to get past one of those guns. But if you had 50 tiny things trying to get past it at once, maybe 2 or 3 of them would get through. And that's the way that a lot of naval architects in the United States and China and England are thinking right now. And it's a reason why the day of the supercarrier is probably ending.
Well, so then if that's the case, then is the force projection going to be from space? How is that going to work? You've talked about the power of the importance of satellites and the fact that the idea of surprise attack now is almost impossible, given space-based satellites are the supercarriers. What's making the supercarriers obsolete? Is it what we just talked about, the hypersonic weapons, autonomous weapons, those things? Or is it all of those factors?
Remember, there's been a lot of hype about hypersonic weapons. They're not that different from ballistic missiles that have existed for since the 1960s, and it's not clear that they'll actually hit what they're aimed at. So far, what the tests have shown, especially the Chinese tests, they've managed to get a missile that air breathing is the lingo, that doesn't carry liquid oxygen, that takes oxygen out of the air. They've managed to get a missile like that to move at about 5,000 miles an hour. And that's an impressive technical achievement. Can they actually get it to hit anything? That's not clear at all. In tests, they've tended to go way far of their marks. So, but it's still a concern. Probably they'll get more accurate and more effective, and probably we'll need to build some too. When you look at, well, there's a pretty good book by a recently retired admiral called 2034, projecting what naval warfare might be like in that year. And it's miniature submarines and tiny drones and very long range missiles. And that may be what's going to happen, because every military advantage is fleeting. My big hope, and the public policy hope that I hope Congress will stay behind, is that we need to keep America having the strongest Navy in the world, because that's not only good for us, not only good for the whole Western Hemisphere. Remember the Monroe Doctrine, who enforces it? United States Navy enforces the Monroe Doctrine, and it's been good for everybody in South America. So we want the Navy to stay strong for those reasons, but really the Navy is good for almost all nations of the world. The Navy does not protect the ships of North Korea, Iran, Venezuela, and Cuba. And that's it. It protects everybody else's ships, including the Russian ships. And that's a good condition for the world to be in.
Well, so then you mentioned Russia, you've mentioned China. And you write, well, you just mentioned the Monroe Doctrine. Let me ask you about something you don't emphasize in the book, and perhaps unfair of me to do so. About why didn't you write about this? But you don't mention much about the Carter Doctrine. You talk about the Strait of Malacca, and there are 4 references to the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, the U.S. Navy is very active in the Persian Gulf, has been, will be, because of the Carter Doctrine. You focused more on the Strait of Malacca than the Strait of Hormuz. Why?
Because the Strait of Malacca is so important to international trade now. By volume of international trade, the Strait of Malacca is what's happening. It's more important than the Hormuz or any of the other straits in the world. About a third of the globe's trade passes through the Strait of Malacca. And if something really bad is going to go on with global trade and supply chain, we've just seen in the last year how much you would feel it if there's only minor problems with the global supply chain. The problems we're having this year, they're real, but they're really minor. If something bad happened, it's going to happen in the Strait of Malacca, and it would be real bad. It would be especially bad for the Chinese. Their economy is totally dependent on that body of water, and it makes them militarily vulnerable in a way that we are not. The United States Navy or Air Force or both could close the Strait of Malacca. China's economy would be strangled, and they know it. And that's one of the reasons I don't think we're going to go to war with China. There's no similar place that they could close would strangle the American economy. I think American thinking generally, we got to think more about the blue water. We got to think more about the Pacific Rim. We got to be more concerned with the Indo-Pacific. And we got to be more concerned with the Strait of Malacca, which sounds like something out of some magical fairy tale to most people, but it's all too real.
Well, so then that leads me to think about the South China Sea, and you mentioned the 9-dash map, which I've had Daniel Yergin on the podcast, and he has a great chapter in his new book, The New Map, about the 9-dash map. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about that history? Because I think that's one of the I love maps, have loved maps for a long time, but the history of the 9-dash map and why China has claimed such a large area of ocean territory, you point out, is one of the areas, that's one of the places where, if we're going to have conflict, that's a likely area. So tell me about the 9-dash map and why China sees the South China Sea the way it does.
Well, if you look at a map of the coast of China and go south, what people call the South China Sea really should be called the South of China Sea, because it's almost all south of China. It is an area that for more than 1,000 years, Chinese military ships have been sailing. They view it as China view it as their national water, in the same way that we look at the Gulf of Mexico and we say, well, look, that belongs to us. It's mostly enclosed by the United States, not entirely, but most of it's got the United States around it. And anyway, if you try to pull something funky in the Gulf of Mexico, we're going to deal with you. That's the attitude the Chinese have to the South China Sea. But it doesn't correspond with international law. The Chinese are signatories to the Law of the Sea Treaty. The Law of the Sea Treaty sets out a series of boundary marking devices, and the Chinese claim a lot more than the South China Sea than they're entitled to under the Law of the Sea Treaty. And their neighbors, Vietnam, Indonesia, Japan, the Koreas, they also have claims on that water body, and the Chinese are kind of trying to brush them off, and it creates a possibility for conflict. Now, you can also say in their defense, I think you should try to, I say in Blue Age, you should try to walk a mile in China's shoes to understand why they behave the way that they do. There are American and British warships sailing through the South China Sea pretty much every day. Those ships are potent and powerful, and they come from foreign powers that are not necessarily hostile to China, but they remind China of the fact that there have been foreign troops on its soil within living memory, and that the rest of the world has not hesitated to mess with Chinese national sovereignty. We've done it many times. By contrast, no such issues in the Gulf of Mexico. If the Chinese and the Russians were every day sailing warships through the Gulf of Mexico, we would be real unhappy about that. So the Chinese have a comparable situation in the South China Sea. It makes it a tinderbox, and possibility for conflict does exist, and the goal of both nations should be to avoid a conflict breaking out.
But you make the argument, I think, that the Chinese are not going, that a major conflict between the U.S. and China is unlikely, but it doesn't mean that there wouldn't be some other conflict between China and Vietnam, China and Indonesia, China and some of those other neighbors. Does that ring true to you? I mean, can you handicap that? Who would be the most likely people in the conflict besides Taiwan, China?
Well, we've come very close to naval combat between China and Vietnam twice in the last 10 years. And Americans, because of our sad history with Vietnam, we forget that the Vietnamese despise the Chinese. They have a much worse history with the Chinese than they do with Americans. You go to Vietnam now, people are basically pro-American in Vietnam. They're definitely not pro-Chinese. China has fooled around with the KISS, the Vietnamese people, and with their land for a long time, as recently as invading them in 1980. And the Vietnamese are very aggressive toward the Chinese. And they know that they were able to expel the world's #1 military power from their territory. I don't think they're afraid to fight the world's #2 military power. The other conflict that I worry about is China and India. Of people that I interviewed some Indian naval officers, and they basically said, look, man, the Chinese are not going to be stupid enough to fight the United States. They may be stupid enough to fight us. If there's going to be active battle on the oceans, it's going to be on the Indian Ocean, and it's going to be between China and India. And the Indians are very determined to be sure that they come out on top of any such conflict.
Gotcha. So what's your view then on the Biden administration toward the Navy? Because one of the other points you make about the expense of the Navy, and you also point out how these ships are made for long deployments, and that they have to keep the creature comforts for the sailors because they're going to be deployed for a long time. Is the Biden administration, in your view, I mean, they're under fire from a lot of areas now, but did they have what is their view on the U.S. Navy, and do they need to get religion? Do they need to obviously need to read your book? But tell me how you view how they're approaching this.
I was going to say they do need to read my book.
By the way, the book is The Blue Age. My guest, by the way, station identification, Gregg Easterbrook. He's there you go. It's on my Kindle here too. It's right. Where is it? Here it is. There we go. On the Kindle, there it is. They need to read your book, but what are they missing? Something? What are they missing there?
I don't think they've enunciated very much military policy yet at all. Of course, they've only been in office for a little less than a year. And the main military event under Biden so far has been the withdrawal from Afghanistan. The first budget that they've submitted basically continues all current programs at the current level plus inflation. The budget doesn't change things one way or the other. At some point, they'll do a quadrennial defense review, and they'll have to articulate some kind of policy for the Navy. They just haven't gotten to it yet. So but one can only speculate about what they might say.
Well, let's jump back to the supply chain issue, because as you said, you've been writing for a long time. You've been in journalism for a long time. You finished this book before everyone began talking about supply chains, and now everyone's talking about supply chains. Was the snafu inevitable? Was it inevitable that we'd chirp over all these container ships, and that putting all of so many chips on so few ships, if I can make a rhyme there? Was this inevitable?
I don't know if you would say it was inevitable. It was certainly always a possibility. And the middle third of Blue Age is about international trade, which I think is good for almost everybody. I go through all the arguments about why international trade leaves almost everybody better off. Okay, if you're North Korean, it doesn't help you, but almost everybody is better off, including the people who live in the Ohio Valley in the United States, who are the ones who complain the most bitterly about globalization. Most of them have benefited from globalization. And especially if you look at the reduction of poverty in China, it's just spectacular. I quote Bernie Sanders, who's of course anti-trade, standing in the port of Los Angeles in 2016, shaking his fist and saying, "Global trade destroys jobs," which just isn't true on a factual basis. Since the year 2000, when the current World Trade Organization deal was signed, employment has risen, certainly in the United States. It's risen throughout Europe. It's risen almost everywhere in the world, while poverty has declined. In the year here's the key fact, the year that Bernie Sanders was born, 60% of the world lived in extreme poverty. Last year, 10% of the world lived in extreme poverty, and the human family was 3 times the size as it was in the year that Bernie Sanders has decline, was born. So the era of global trade has led to a fantastic decline in poverty. Most of it's occurred in China and other places of the Pacific Rim, so we don't see it. It isn't palpable to us here in the United States, but it's been a remarkable achievement. And I actually give the Chinese government a lot of credit for the way they've reduced poverty in their country. It's amazing, but it's also entirely dependent on global trade. And if global trade falls apart, China will fall apart also, and that's something to bear in mind. So, knowing all these things, in 2019, I went to the port of Los Angeles and hung out there interviewing people for a month. I watched the ships come and go. I got a sense of how they operate. And the 5th chapter in the Blue Age is about the Port of Los Angeles, how it works and why it's so important. And the book comes out, and 2 months later, the front page of every newspaper is Port of Los Angeles because of supply chain disruption.
So I've been in the port in Dubai, and it's not as big, right? With it, but it really is a remarkable set of. I mean, just the cranes and the way they move, and the amount of stuff that they're accounting for, and these massive stacks of containers. I mean, it's incredibly impressive to see, and just the tonnage of stuff that they move. But you said that you didn't think that this was that the current supply chain is. That this was fairly minor. There was a piece in the Wall Street Journal the other day that said some logistics experts are saying this will take a year or more to sort out. Do you have any sense on that? Does that sound right to you, or what do you make of this?
Certainly, it's possible. The supply chain disruptions are real, and I think the main cause is labor shortages linked to COVID. And since we don't know when the COVID problem is going to end, I think the COVID problem is becoming manageable, but that's manageable compared to what? I mean, how long is it going to go on? So we need the COVID problem to end as a problem in order for labor availability at the ports of the world to return to normal, and then the system will gradually shake itself out. But whether that takes 1 year or maybe 2 years, I wouldn't attempt to predict.
So you mentioned China and the U.S. So, I mean, what I've heard you say in the book and now even here is that you don't think major conflict between the U.S. and China is likely because they're so interdependent. What is that the main thing that I think you wrote something in effect, there never in your history been two great rival powers that are so intertwined, or something to that effect. Am I remembering correctly?
In human history, there has never been a great power relationship like the one that exists today between China and the United States. We're antagonistic toward each other, but we're both dependent on each other. If you look back at the commentary before World War I, or what then called the Great War, many people will point out, well, in 1913 and 1912, people were saying that trade would make war impossible, and then look what happened. But they really weren't. If you read the commentaries of that time, it wasn't that people said that it made war impossible. That people were saying it would make war counterproductive. And at that time, about 5% of the world's GDP was global trade. Today, 26% of the world's global GDP is trade. If there's a major power war that stops trade, that loss of roughly 20% of the world's economic activity, that's the same as the amount of economic activity that was lost in the Great Depression. And it would trigger another Great Depression. So I mentioned earlier the Naval War College in Rhode Island, where there are lots of smart people. And I quote one in the book as saying, suppose there was a war between China and the United States. What would victory even look like? The United States could win every battle and be desperately harmed by that war. The Chinese could win every battle and be desperately harmed by that war. There's never been a relationship between two great powers like this before. And I think it makes it, you can't say that war is impossible. Sadly, it's very possible. But I think war is really unlikely as long as American and Chinese leaders are rational.
Well, so then let's talk about back to the U.S. Navy. Then you talk about the national debt at several points in the book, and at the beginning of the book you wrote that you're going to begin and end by endorsing a strong U.S. Navy as a positive for nearly all the nations of the world, as a force for general prosperity and for reduction of developing world poverty, improving billions of people's lives in ways that do not necessarily meet the eye. So but you make the point very clearly that keeping the Navy is incredibly expensive. Is this, but that there's not a recognition among the policymakers in Washington that it's an essential part. Maybe I would say you're arguing it's the most essential of all the branches of the military. But is there anyone in Washington really making that case?
I would say there isn't a particularly strong pro-Navy lobby in Washington. And where I live close to Washington, Washington is just 50 miles from the most important maritime facility in the world, which is the United States Naval Academy. And it doesn't have a lot to do with Washington politics. Yes, there are subcommittees in the House and the Senate that watch naval affairs, but it hasn't been naval power has not been a factor in presidential politics since the 2012 debate that we mentioned. And it wasn't a major question for an American president. Ronald Reagan was the last one who really cared about naval power or wanted to alter it in any way. And Jimmy Carter before him also did. Carter, of course, a former US Navy officer. But presidents since Reagan have not been particularly interested in naval power. We just kind of take it for granted. The structure of our society is that we panic over whatever's not working properly. And everything that is properly, okay, we just take it for granted. So right now the Navy is working fine, and so it gets taken for granted. I suppose it's better to be working fine and taken for granted than to be in some kind of crisis condition.
Well, fair enough. So, let's talk about piracy, because that's one of the other things that you mentioned in the book. And piracy, I want to talk about piracy in the Arctic. So, you write about the U.S. Marine Corps that was founded largely, or they're famous, the shores of Tripoli line, about fighting pirates in Libya. What's the state of piracy globally? Is it gone down? Stayed the same? Where is it concentrated?
Piracy on the Horn of Mexico the Horn of Africa, about 10 years ago got a lot of attention. It's since declined a lot, partly because the U.S. Navy started shooting at people who are pirates, and that changes the dynamic a lot. But partly because these ultra-large container liners are coming into use. The ultra-large container liners, their deck line is 30, 40, or even 60 feet above the water. You can't board them. You need a helicopter to board a modern large container liner. So pirates really just can't do anything about them. There's still some piracy on the west coast of Africa involving oil shipments, and some piracy in the southern part of the Gulf of Mexico, in the area of Mexico that's oil producing. But it's considered relatively minor. But I think the current view right now is that piracy is under control.
And so now, what about the Arctic? You also talk about the future of the Navy and how the world is, the geography of the world and trade patterns are going to change with as the Arctic ice decreases. Who does that benefit? You talk a lot about the law of the sea treaties, the law of the sea treaty, and about the governance of the Arctic. There's a lot of resources in the Arctic. So who stand to be the winners, losers in the new potential for Arctic transit for global shipping?
Well, this is an issue that the great nations really need to deal with in a more serious way than they are. Enough ice has melted that it's become somewhat possible to move around in the Arctic seas. By the middle of this century, the Arctic Ocean will be completely navigable. It could happen even sooner than 2050. It could happen as soon as 2040. We'll have ships sailing over the North Pole on a regular basis. And it will also expose a great deal of natural resources. There's almost certainly a lot of natural gas under the Arctic Circle. There may be a lot of petroleum, and there may be other resources too. So who's going to benefit? It's going to be the high north nations. In the Blue Age, I call them the Narnia nations, because you remember from the Chronicles of Narnia, Narnia was a snowbound northern kingdom. It's the snowbound northern kingdoms of the northern hemisphere that will benefit. And who has the most coastline area with the Arctic is Russia, China, the United States, Greenland, which really means Denmark, and a few others. Those are countries that will be better off. They'll have more access to minerals. They'll have more access to shipping lanes. And those are, by and large, the countries that are already pretty well off. The equatorial nations and the southern hemisphere nations are not going to benefit from this at all. And by and large, the equatorial nations and the southern hemisphere nations are the ones that are already relatively poor. So the developments that are going to happen at the top of the world in the North Pole or Santa Claus area, they're going to benefit the nations that are already benefit.
So maybe further, we already talked about the North-South divide, but Canada, the U.S., Russia, the other northern countries, Norway, I'm guessing Sweden, some of those other, the Norwegian countries, those are the ones that are going to benefit and continue then. Could that further exacerbate the just income inequality globally then, because there's going to be so much more trade concentrated in the north?
It sure may, and it may save Russia's bacon in the sense that all those nations that we just mentioned, if you look at their relative positions in the northern polar region, Russia is the one that stands to benefit the most from minerals, from passageways across the top of the world. Russia knows that it could get a lot wealthier because of the northern polar seas. And I think this gives Russia an incentive to be peaceful. If they act belligerent, they may lose their access to this new, very rich land, or in some cases, not land, but water. But I'm hoping this will make the Russians peaceful. I hope that's not a naive view.
Well, you also point out that the Russians are far ahead in terms of building icebreakers for this. They've got
Yes.
was it one or two already nuclear powered icebreakers that they've deployed?
Yes, for the next 10 or 15 years, icebreakers are going to be a really precious resource, because if you want to travel, if you want to go the northern route across the top of the world and cut the travel time between east and west to the bare minimum number of days, for most of the next 10 years or so, you're still going to need an icebreaker. So when you get 15 or 20 years down the road, ships probably won't need to be accompanied by icebreakers. But right now, the Russians have a pretty strong monopoly on icebreakers. And the Chinese are building icebreakers, even though there's no frozen water touching China anywhere.
Oh, I didn't realize that. Well, let's talk about the nuclear propulsion, because this is one interesting that just pops in my head, that one of the things that's happened, the Russians, in terms of developing nuclear energy technologies, they've deployed, if memory serves, the power ship that they've deployed in Siberia and Pivek uses two icebreaker reactors. If I believe that's correct, the same model or very similar models to the reactors that are on the icebreakers are the same ones as in the power ships. How important has nuclear propulsion been to the Navy?
The U.S. Navy. Well, all of our submarines are nuclear powered, and nuclear powered enables you to stay hidden underwater for months at a time. You don't have to refuel. And the reactors make air using electrolysis. So you can stay underwater and totally hidden as long as your food and medicine supplies hold out, essentially. The United States Navy also uses nuclear power for all of its supercarriers. Nuclear power, 2 generations ago, was being used in a lot of warships, and it's kind of fallen out of favor because it's more expensive and more complicated than other kinds of propulsion. You really need nuclear powered frigates. Probably you don't really need that. And also because there's been such an irrational turn of political opposition to nuclear power all throughout. You know the arguments about nuclear power better than I do, Robert, but all throughout the United States and Western Europe, voters are angry and want to get rid of nuclear power, even though it's one of the answers to greenhouse gases. But that's affected the Navy too. They know the U.S. Navy knows that the fewer nuclear propelled ships they try to get funded, the less political controversy they'll get into.
Do you think it's that simple that because the Navy has the best nuclear safety record of any nuclear entity in the world? I mean, they really have shown incredible safety, incredible ability to build safe reactors, manage the life cycle. They have their own waste disposal system waste disposal supply chain and in New Mexico at, what is the name of that? It's near Carlsbad. In any case, I mean, but I just wanted you to, if you could, it's not a major topic of the book, but just how the use of nuclear then changed the U.S. Navy we went from sail to coal to oil, and now nuclear. I mean, it's been transformative, hasn't it?
It's had a big effect, especially on the way the U.S. Navy does business, because we're the tactical word for it is forward deployed. Most of our warships are based far from the United States. They're based all across the world. And the fact that some of them don't need to refuel or don't need to refuel constantly, they refuel only every few years because they're nuclear powered, that really helps for the way the U.S. Navy operates. But despite, very well the irrationality about nuclear power in the United States, even though the track record of the Navy is excellent. The track record of commercial nuclear production in the United States is also excellent. It doesn't matter. People hate nuclear power. What we see from politics, especially in the last generation, is that what people want to believe is so much more compelling than what you can show with rational arguments or facts. I mean, people don't even like the word fact anymore. They just want to believe what they want to believe, and they want to believe that nuclear power is evil, and yet they also want to believe that the world is ending because of global warming. And you tell them, well, then let's use nuclear power to stop greenhouse gases, and you can't get people to deal with that argument on a rational basis.
Yeah. I guess the one other thought that just pops in my head is that Guantanamo Bay, if memory serves, was originally seized from Cuba as a coaling station, right? That this was viewed as a strategic location because the U.S. needed coal to fuel its warships. And then, of course, then oil came along and showed that it was far better in terms of propulsion, in terms of energy density. And then oil became a strategic commodity. And that explains a lot of Britain's involvement in the Persian Gulf and so on. But it just, as you're talking about these things, the geography of the Navy and its fuel dependence is also something that the Navy's always had to work through, right? If we're going to be there, we've got to figure out a way to replenish our ships and so on.
The U.S. Navy, you may be interested in this, Robert, because if you're interested in electricity, U.S. Navy and the British and the Royal Navy are building all electric warships, which are different from nuclear powered ships. They have gas turbines that use fossil fuel, natural gas or petroleum, to spin generators and generate electricity, but all the rest of the ship, including its propulsion, is electric. And electric ships emit a lot less than regular turbine diesel ships emit. So it's a step forward, but it does not solve the fueling problem in the way you were just talking about. You got to stop somewhere and take on natural gas.
Yeah, actually, I looked up what was the puller, the Chesty Puller. I know his nickname was Chesty. With the Sydney Puller,
Lewis Puller.
Lewis Puller. I actually looked up the propulsion systems on those. Those are LM 2500s. I think they're General Electric gas turbines. Right. The propulsion system. They use the turbines to produce power, and then use power for propulsion. Right. It's an electric drive system, similar to what you'd find in a railroad engine, or now some of these massive big mining trucks. They use the same kind of produce electricity. So we've been talking nearly an hour, and my guest again is Gregg Easterbrook. His latest book is The Blue Age: How the U.S. Navy Created Global Prosperity and Why We're in Danger of Losing It. Just a last few things, Greg. Back in 95, you wrote a book called A Moment on the Earth: The Coming Age of Environmental Optimism. And since then, you've written a couple of other books about why we need to be more optimistic. And I'm, I like Molly Ivins, I'm optimistic to the point of idiocy, but we also live in an age of a lot of doomism, and especially around climate change, around, I'll say it this way, the Malthusians sure seem like they haven't gone away yet. Are you still as optimistic as you were? Do you stand by the title from 25 years ago, or 26 years ago?
Well, Moment on the Earth, yes. The subtitle was The Coming Age of Environmental Optimism. And whoa, boy, was I wrong about that. I couldn't have been more wrong about that. Everything else in the book is correct. The book argues that in the 1990s, people thought smog and acid rain and species loss were going to completely overwhelm us, and that there'd be mass starvation, and none of that stuff has happened. And I correctly predicted that none of that stuff would happen, and then went on to say, and this will make everyone optimistic, and that, whoa, did not happen. We seem to prefer to be pessimistic in the United States. It's part of our national character. I've written 4 books arguing for optimism now. And I feel like I've said what I needed to say on that subject. But my larger conclusion is not that optimism makes you complacent. It doesn't. Optimism is the reason for reform. Optimism is the belief that you can fix problems. Pessimists think that you can't fix problems. So we look at climate change today. Climate change is obviously happening. I'm an optimist about climate change. That greenhouse gases are fundamentally an air pollution problem. We've reduced other kinds of air pollution very effectively in the past. We can reduce this kind too. If you're a pessimist, you think, oh, the world is going to be destroyed. I shouldn't have children. The New York Times actually ran an editorial saying that no one should have a child because climate change is going to destroy the world. Besides the fact that you wonder about what mental process led to that article, it's just not factually true. Climate change can be overcome. And because I'm an optimist, I think we're going to do it. But optimism is not popular. I'll tell you an interviewer asked me a year ago, so what do you want to be in your obituary? And I said, well, why are you asking me this? Do you know something that I don't already know? But I said, well, I wanted to.
Have you been talking to my wife or someone I know?
Talk to my wife, who then he really would know something that I don't know.
It's possible.
But I said what I think should be in my obituary is the aspect of Easterbrook's writing that made people angry was that he was an optimist. And I think that sentence kind of expresses a lot of what's going on in America today.
Well, as you say that, I think that line where no politician ever got elected by saying things are going to be just fine, right? It's there's the death, there's destruction at the door. The other guy's going to tear everything apart. You need to vote for me. But but you said it's fundamental to the American character, which it seems odd to me. And I just explored this for just a minute because there is still in the United States. I'm very bullish on the United States. I'm always bullish. I'm going to always will be bullish on the U.S. just because natural advantages that we have, including not least of which is the Constitution and the fact that people believe it, right? And they quote it continually. But what makes you say that the Americans, what was it, we prefer to be pessimistic? Where does that come from?
Well, I will tell this. This is also something I said to an interviewer a couple of weeks ago, that if you could buy stock in countries, I would want to hold the United States. I want stock in the United States because I think we're going to be fine and we're going to improve. But it's really more correct for me to say that pessimism is the American intellectual strain. American intellectuals, literary figures and academics have always been deeply pessimistic. And I think it's partly because that's how you get career success in those professions.
Yeah, right. That you're not going to get You're not going to get tenure by saying, "Yeah, don't worry." Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. Well, maybe you already answered this, but I'm going to ask it anyway in a slightly different. So, you're optimistic, but what gives you hope?
What gives me hope? Well, I think I'm not a futurist, but I think technology can reduce most of our problems. It's no panacea, but I think technology can reduce pollution. It can improve healthcare outcomes. It can ensure an ample food supply. And as I pointed, there's a chapter in It's Better Than It Looks from 3 years ago, showing that everyone thought technology would get more dangerous and destructive. Instead, it's steadily gotten safer, which is something you know from your own writing. There's some, weapons are incredibly dangerous, but in general, technology gets ever safer. So I think that's a hopeful sign. I think the psychology of the country, have we reached a post-racial stage yet? I don't know. You can't legislate what people feel deep inside. But I do think the next 2 generations will be the least prejudiced generations ever raised in human history. And I think that's great. I think that gives us hope for the future too. And I think America will decline in relative importance next to China and also Brazil and Indonesia and a couple of other rising countries. But we're still going to be the United States. We're still going to have our Constitution. We're still going to be the country that everybody wants to live in. That's going to last for centuries. I'm very bullish on that.
Well, I didn't write this down, but you mentioned China. What are China? I like what you said. What are China's biggest challenges?
Oh, China is much closer to the edge than we appreciate in the United States. They've done a great job of reducing poverty, and a really great job. They've done a great job with their infrastructure. Millions of people a year used to die in floods in China. They've almost eliminated flooding as a cause of civic death. It's an invisible achievement that we're not even aware of here, but it's a huge achievement for the human family. So they've done some things well, and they've increased the education level of their population very dramatically in the last 2 generations. But otherwise, they're politically unstable. The Chinese Communist Party is a repressive organization. The smarter their population gets, the more they will resist being repressed. China is aging faster than we are. By 2050, the Chinese will have more senior citizens than the entire population of the United States in that year. And they don't really have any answer for how they're going to handle the pension demands of their aging population. China could fall apart at pretty much a moment's notice. I don't have any worries about the United States falling apart. Despite what's trendy to say on cable news shows, I think the United States society is fundamentally stable and will stay stable for a long time.
But if China falls apart, as we talked about before, if China falls apart, it's going to have big repercussions here in the
Oh
U.S.
yes, God, yes, yeah. It would have
So having a
repercussions
stable China is in the U.S. interest.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Some commentators don't like the fact that American public officials and others are friendly to the Chinese. I think we have a self-interest in that. We benefit from being friendly to the Chinese. We as a society, I mean.
Yeah. Well, and without China, there's no Walmart. I mean, pretty much everything in Walmart is from China, as far as I can tell.
That is true.
So I asked you about what gives you hope, which is usually my last question, but I wanted to ask you, you've got another book coming out. What are you reading these days? Your bibliography, it's not a formal bibliography, kind of an informal bibliography in your book, which I like the way you did your footnotes and so on, the way that you organized that. What are you reading? What's on your book's nightstand? Or
my nightstand book right now is the New York Times 1619 Project book. It just came out as a book. I read it when it was in the newspaper. It's now a book, and I'm reading that.
George Will had a pretty blistering piece about it just in the Washington Post. You think he's wrong? How do you come out on that?
I don't know. I haven't read it yet. I haven't read the book yet. I think the newspaper version had obvious, just plain errors, claiming that the only reason for the American Revolution was to preserve slavery was not a sophisticated view. They've now changed it to say one of the reasons. You got to give some credence to that. I think. Nikki Hannah Jones, the main author of that book, she's definitely on to something. American history has not dealt with the pervasiveness of the effects of slavery in society or the economic consequences of slavery in society, the extent to which people who weren't the slaves benefited from the value that the slaves created. She's really on to something there. And eventually it will lead to some new consensus about American history that will be constructive. I don't think it'll be exactly what the 1619 crowd thinks, because it is really hard to believe that the real reason for the American Revolution was to preserve slavery, and yet they managed to hide the conspiracy so well that not even Martin Luther King ever noticed that it was there, or Frederick Douglass, or all the others. All of them were fooled too. That's just kind of hard to believe, but they are onto something. And like I say, I'm reading the book version and learning from it.
Good. Well, thank you. My guest is Gregg Easterbrook. He's the author of The Blue Age: How the U.S. Navy Created Global Prosperity and Why We're in Danger of Losing It. It's available at all fine bookstores. Make sure and buy a copy. You can also find Gregg at GreggEasterbrook.com. Gregg, any last thoughts before we sign off?
No, I think we covered everything, Robert.
Good. Well, many thanks for being on the Power Hungry podcast. And to all of you in podcast land, thanks for tuning in. Give us a good rating on those podcast channels. And until next time, see ya.
Okay. Thanks, Robert.
You bet.